Islamism is a subset of Islam. It's not perhaps a majority. We need to have a look at the root causes, and we need to look at where that anti-Semitism is coming from in society.
And you're quite right to draw a distinction between Islam as a faith and Islamism as an ideology. It's like, the difference between patriotism and fascism.
I think the whole family should be deported, frankly.
I'm sure in his heart he grieves, of course he does. But act, man! Hello and welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketchwriter of The Spectator.
And this week we'll be looking at the tragedy of the Bondi Beach massacre. What does it tell us about the ideology behind this horrific assault and society's response to it?
And in the week of the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth, we'll be looking at this most beloved of British authors, the cultural resonance of her work and the way in which it is often being butchered by modern adapters.
And, to continue the literary theme, we'll be asking what makes the perfect whodunit.
Over the weekend, we witnessed a horrific mass shooting in Australia, which targeted the country's Jewish community during their Hanukkah celebration on Bondi Beach. The attack left 15 people dead and another 42 hospitalised. Chillingly, the attackers turned out to be a father and son, Sajid and Naveed Akram. I would say that such things are shocking, but frankly, they no longer shock me. I feel this is horrific, senseless, barbaric, evil, disgusting. But what scares me is how this actually feels entirely normal and completely unsurprising.
When I heard the news, I felt exactly as you felt, the sense of horror, but not amazement, not surprise. And I felt something very similar following the attack at the Heaton Park Synagogue in Manchester, which of course occurred on Yom Kippur. And the idea of Jewish people being targeted by killers on the holiest days is offensive beyond measure and grotesque and evil. But it doesn't surprise us because what we've seen has been both a drumbeat of anti-Semitism, and we might explore what's behind that, which has led to violent acts targeting Jewish people. And it's been happening for years now. We've had attacks on kosher supermarkets in France. We've had attacks on synagogues and shuls. We have in our own country, as our columnist Jonathan Sacerdoti points out, security outside primary schools of the kind that you would expect outside foreign embassies or defence bases. And we're not inured to it, but the fact that it's not surprising, I think, points to a consistent failure to understand where this violence comes from, because unless we properly understand that, I don't think that we can counter it.
No, I don't think we can. Each time there is an attack, atrocity or massacre like this, it also feels like there is a concerted effort to ensure that we have one kind of regime-approved conversation about what just happened.
Yes.
We do not discuss the root causes. For example, when it comes to the Jewish community in Britain and across the West, leaders will often talk about beefing up security efforts around schools. And yes, it makes me angry every day when I walk to the nearby tube and I go past the Jewish synagogue and school, which have that level of security. It makes me furious that my Jewish friends have to live in fear of being gunned down at all times, and particularly high holidays. But I feel like we have that discussion about security. We often dwell, and I'm, the heroic man, Ahmed al-Ahmed, who saved countless people on that beach by disarming the attacker, deserves every accolade and support that Australian society can give him. But I worry that, again, the fact that he himself was a Muslim means that the regime-approved conversation is, well, not all Muslims look this heroic man, but actually Islamism is a subset of Islam. It's not perhaps a majority, but it's sizable enough that it can routinely cause this level of carnage, chaos, and death and destruction. We need to have a look at the root causes, and we need to look at where that anti-Semitism is coming from in society, not just how you better defend schools and synagogues.
Completely. It's as though anti-Semitism is talked about as sort of naturally occurring phenomenon, a virus against which some appropriate security measures should be taken. So in this case, we've had the diversion by the Australian Prime Minister into talking about gun laws.
Yes.
Australia has got quite strict gun laws. Maybe they should be stricter. But that's not the point. Because, of course, the Heaton Park attack wasn't perpetrated by someone carrying a gun, and it is perfectly possible, if you're intent on murder or mass murder, to assemble the materials required in order to do devastating damage to human life without going anywhere near firearms. So it's a diversion, and it is part of, as you say, this particular diversion. So one, you never have a proper examination of where Islamism comes from. So Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, talked about this ideology having grown up in the last 10 years. As Kemi Badenoch would say, wrong. This ideology, Islamism, has a heritage going back to, broadly 100 years ago. And to understand it, you need to understand the intellectual. That doesn't, I hope, dignify them with any sense of rationality, but the intellectual roots of this poison. The second thing, as you say, is that no one is allowed to, or if they do, they're very quickly told that they should silence themselves. No one is allowed to discuss genuine multiculturalism. So the idea that you should have a strong, cohesive national identity and that you should recognize threats to it from Islamism also, and here I'm becoming regime-approved myself, from other totalitarian, authoritarian and evil ideologies, and they are worrisome. But the fact that unless you have a strong commitment to democratic freedoms and the willingness to defend them, that you'll get more of this, that, again, is not discussed. So, or if it is, you hear this the sound of delicate hands going up to clutch pearls or the shushing away of the uncomfortable critics. And the other thing, which is seldom discussed, though, again, it has been acknowledged, is the way in which a significant section of the radical left provide cover for this hatred by relativizing it and by turning the conversation back onto Israel. I should say that there's another element in anti-Semitism, which is an old problem, which I had thought had become marginalized, which is now coming back with great force, which is that on the ethno-nationalist right of politics now, you see it more in America, but it is happening here in the UK as well. You have people entertaining and saying things about Jews in Israel that they wouldn't have done.
Yes.
5 or 10 years ago.
Of course.
So they all come together and they're all worthy of analysis in order to better understand how to fight back.
I agree. It's a virus that kind of metastasizes in numerous different ways, each of which deserves its own conversation. I mean, there's a lot to discuss in what you've just said. I mean, I think the moral relativism of the left is palpable in the response to this particular incident. I was actually quite shocked by the remarks made by Dale Vince, who is, I think, the Labour Party's single biggest donor.
Yes, one of them, certainly. Yeah. Yes, the eco-entrepreneur.
Yes, that's right. And he explicitly drew an equivalence between Israeli policy towards Gaza and the attack itself.
Yes, he seemed to suggest that Netanyahu would be pleased. Yes,
he did. And he said Netanyahu wants anti-Semitism to be a thing. He validates him. He acts to make it so. It's astonishing to me that you can have people who are sort of part and parcel of the British establishment now who feel confident pronouncing in public that basically this attack can partly be justified on the basis of a foreign country's policy on warfare. You know, that Jews in Western countries should almost be prepared for those reprisals against them. Do you know what I mean? This is a heinous way of looking at the world.
Oh, completely. You have a whole cast of characters. Dale Vince is one. Then you have musicians like Brian Eno and Roger Waters, who release tracks or organise concerts ostensibly to provide support to suffering Palestinians, in fact, to provide a focus for not a critique of Israel's actions, but a campaign against Israel's existence. And you also have, politicians like Zara Sultana. Perhaps we shouldn't even mention her, but she for example, argued that her nascent party, formed, of course, with Jeremy Corbyn, should not have a coalition with the Greens because the Greens still believed in having diplomatic relations with Israel. Now, there'll be some people who will be saying, well, why are you conflating Israel with Jews? You know, anti-Semitism is not linked always to the actions, the existence or criticism of Israel. It is a separate thing. Yes, historically it has been. But exactly as you say, Maddie, anti-Semitism has mutated over time. And one of the forms that it now takes is a belief that the Jewish home, the Jewish nation, Israel, the only Jewish nation in the world, is somehow illegitimate, should be delegitimized, shouldn't exist, that it's a settler nation, an apartheid nation that is ipso facto illegitimate. And you don't get that about any other country. No one says that other countries shouldn't exist. And a double standard, the old anti-Semitic way of operating, applies here, whereby Israel is held to different standards when it's seeking to defend itself. And Israel is also linked to atrocities in the way that Dale Vince has, by some suggestion that its prime minister is secretly glorying in this tragedy because it provides him with a level of political armor. It's a disgusting continuum, and you see even in the last couple of months, popular culture figures like Bob Vylan at Glastonbury saying death to the IDF, but also Primal Scream, the Scots band led by Bobby Gillespie, Scots rock band, having as the background to one of its concerts the Star of David and swastikas being projected onto the faces of Jewish and Israeli figures. These people are, they think either that they're making a principled political stand or they're being transgressive, but they're attempting to deploy a symbol of genocide, mass murder, the worst crime in humanity, as though it was some sort of adjunct to their twisted creativity. And at the same time, you also have people like the American podcaster Nick Fuentes appearing on Piers Morgan's show. Piers tried his best to have a go at him, but Nick Fuentes says Hitler's cool. And, the existence of people who are prepared to, take these views on the platforms that we give them, I think is something that we need to counter by pointing out consistently that they're trafficking in misery of the most profound and, degenerate kind.
There is an issue here where I don't think that, I think there are numerous criticisms that can be made of Benjamin Netanyahu, of Israeli actions. I mean, I personally do not think they have done, they have been doing enough to minimize civilian casualties in Gaza. You can make that criticism, but it doesn't mean that I think there is an expectation now that basically Jewish people all over the world have to kind of cut all ties with Israel altogether, the world's only Jewish state, which exists for a reason, because historically it's been very difficult for Jewish people to live safely in many of the countries where they have lived, in both the Middle East and Europe. There are these two camps almost. The progressives demand that you're either one of the good Jews that says, I have nothing to do with Israel, or you're a bad Jew. It's not possible to be a Jewish person who has ties with Israel but is still perhaps critical, etc. You have to basically be all or nothing. It's an extraordinary demand, and it's not a demand that is made of people from any other diaspora around the world. No one says that expats should be held accountable for what the Iranian government does to its citizens or in its attacks through proxies all over the Middle East. Do you know what I mean? It's an astonishing demand that is made of people, and I see it on the progressive left intensifying. I think part of this is because there is a general anti-Western, anti-capitalist bent. And to them, although the my understanding is that Ashkenazi Jews are not the majority in Israel. They have more Mizrahi Sephardi. So there's more Jews who move from other countries in the Middle East because it was no longer safe to live there. Yes. But they have this idea that the Jewish state is kind of like a white country. It's like a European Western country, which I think misunderstands the history completely.
It totally misunderstands. So,
And they don't believe that being Jewish is an ethnic minority either.
No, the first thing is you're absolutely right. The idea of saying if you denounce Israel, then you're an acceptable Jew is ipso facto anti-Semitic, because it's saying you can live, but on terms set by others.
Yes.
We're creating a ghetto in which you're safe, provided you, denounce Netanyahu and sign up to these Guardian-approved principles. That's anti-Semitic. But the hostility towards Israel that exists amongst Islamists, and you're quite right to draw a distinction between Islam as a faith and Islamism as an ideology. It's like the difference between patriotism and fascism. One is a noble sentiment. Islam is an ennobling faith, but Islamism is a totalitarian twisting of its message, just as fascism is a totalitarian twisting of attachment to a nation state. And the Islamists, one of the reasons they hate Israel, exactly as you say, is it is a reminder of the failure of a essentially totalitarian vision, because Israel flourishes as a democracy. Yes, a flawed democracy, but all democracies are flawed. But the fact that it survives and flourishes without natural resources because it's a rules-bound democracy with free speech, free markets, and robust and open disagreement. None of these things apply in any other country in the neighborhood. That is too much to bear. And so, and hostility calcifies or mutates into an ideology that leads to murder.
I think it's important to say that even if Israel was not a functional democracy, it would not justify the massacre of Jewish civilians in the way. And I'm not saying that you're saying that, but I just think it's really important to make this point. This idea that there is any kind of equivalence to be drawn is just quite sickening. Unfortunately, I just think that what will happen after this attack, as with every other attack, is the commentariat will go into like easy mode, basically. Yeah. We'll have conversations in Australia, maybe conversations about gun control. There will be a resistance to talking about the theological underpinnings of Islamism, the way it is backed up by elements of the Hadith and the Quran. There will be, in Britain at least, I mean, we are at the same time that we've had our own Islamist attack very recently, which, were it not for the bravery of those on site at Heaton Park, could have turned into something much greater loss of life, right?
Exactly.
At the same time, our government is trying to push through an Islamophobia definition that may well end up making it harder for people to have these necessary conversations, which the fear is that it may elide, for example, race and religion, so that talking about ideological underpinnings is considered to be borderline racist, even though a race is not an idea and it's not a religion either.
No, and the more we talk about and the more we know about the ideas and the thinkers behind Islamism and extremism, the better armed we are. I think I may have mentioned to you before that I was at a meeting as communities secretary in Cobra when we were discussing the extremist marches, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign marches, and there was some confusion about the ideology behind them. And I asked everyone there, do you know about Said Qutb or Hassan al-Banna or any of the thinkers behind Islamism? Because if we were discussing communism in the 1980s, everyone would know who Marx, Engels, and Lenin was. And around the table, and there were 20 people there, all of whom should have been engaged in dealing with this threat, the only two people who actually knew anything about it were, one, reassuringly, the head of MI5, and two, unsurprisingly, the very shrewd and wise Tom Tugendhat. And that level of ignorance, and it applies across the official classes, not just in the UK, but more broadly, is staggering. We have a conversation now in the UK about whether or not we should ban or prescribe the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the organization that al-Banna founded and that Qutb was associated with, which is the sort of founding Islamist organization Hamas is its Palestinian offshoot. The Muslim Association of Britain is its UK front. But the understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood, how it operates, where it operates, the front organizations it's used, how it's mutated, outside a very closed circle doesn't exist. And you can't have a conversation about Islamism unless you define it. And it might be that some of the points that I've sought to make about it, and others like Tom Tugendhat have sought to make about it, might be wrong. But if people are not arguing from a position of knowledge, then you can't have a constructive conversation to devise the right policies.
I think we need to get better at recognising when people are doing this diversionary tactic and not allowing them to get away with it.
Yeah.
I remember in the wake of the Southport murders, the radio presenter James O'Brien just very quickly was launching into a rant about how this young man was able to purchase knives on Amazon, as if that were was the real culprit. Let's not talk about the massive state failure that was revealed by that terrible, terrible massacre of children, and as you know better than me, the conversation after your former colleague David Amos was murdered by an Islamist who, if I've understood this correctly, was scoping out various MPs for possible assassination, including you. I mean, how terrifying is that? The conversation Parliament had after that was, we were talking about civility online.
Drivelling nonsense.
Absolute guff, absolute nonsense. And as if if everyone had been more be kind, then a guy inculcated in a specific Islamist ideology wouldn't have murdered a British parliamentarian.
David Amos was not killed by an internet troll or by a meme.
No.
He was killed by an Islamist.
And these two attackers on Bondi Beach had clearly trained for this. Yes. Where they trained, that's another question. I'm sure we will find out in due course. But they had, serious capability with firearms. Many security analysts fear that there may be similar attacks and that now Al-Qaeda is able to operate under the mantle of the Taliban. We should expect similar attacks on British soil, perhaps, or America. Lots of analysts are worried that we're about to see a coming spate of violence. I mean, obviously, I hope that doesn't work out, but we need to consider these possibilities as well and not just do our usual don't look back in anger thing. Like, I actually am looking back in anger that a 10-year-old was gunned down for being Jewish, along with defenseless elderly people.
Yes.
And, I feel like that is... Actually, there is a place for anger. Maybe anger can make society learn the lessons it needs to. For example, I'm very angry that... Did you see the response of the killer's mother when she was interviewed? Outside the family home, she said, "My son is a good boy. He doesn't have a firearm. He doesn't even go out. He doesn't mix around with friends. He doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke. He doesn't go to bad places. He goes to work, comes home. He goes to exercise, and that's it." And she said that anyone would be lucky to have a son like that. I think the whole family should be deported, frankly. This is outrageous.
It is outrageous.
Yeah.
It's an example of denial. And you are right that there's also the diversion. Listeners will remember that earlier this year there was a moral panic around adolescence. The drama about a boy who kills one of his classmates because apparently he's been sort of influenced by stuff on the internet in the manosphere. I don't know. I stand to be corrected. But I don't think that MI5 or any genuine security service is that worried, however horrible he is, about Andrew Tate inspiring people to acquire firearms to commit massacres at religious festivals. But for all of the ink spilled on Andrew Tate, and you compare that with the failure to properly analyse the ideology, the origins, and the operations of Islamists, it's just totally out of kilter. And you're right to be angry, Maddie. And that's also one of the reasons why Kemi Badenoch, I think, made the point that, and others have made the point, that it's all very well for Keir Starmer to, light the menorah and talk about the importance of kindness and solidarity. And I'm sure in his heart, he grieves. Of course he does.
Of course he does. I mean, his wife is Jewish and his children are Jewish.
But act, man. And, they were how many months into this government? How many months since the Heaton Park massacre? And if the government has a counter-extremism strategy, would love to know what's in it. Instead, as you pointed out, we've had a fumbled hole-and-corner conversation about Islamophobia, and whatever the problems that we have in violence directed at different minorities, that conversation about closing down an open debate about what is required is beside the point. Maddie, you open your Christmas magazine column by saying, if you like your period dramas butchered, the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth offers us a real treat. Why?
Well, I'm a huge fan of Jane Austen. I reread and read the books endlessly, and someday I'd very much like to go and do a master's maybe or some further study into Jane Austen, because I find her novels astonishing. They can seem so very simple when you first read them, but then you read them multiple times and you realise how many little Easter eggs, tiny details that are hugely significant. She's, I think, more than anyone, a novelist that repays rereading over and over and over again, because you always learn. I've never read a Jane Austen novel and didn't notice something I had never seen before. So with that in mind, I think she's also, because her stories are so romantic but also funny, elegant, witty and memorable, they're obviously often adapted period dramas. And I think ever since the really fantastic Colin Firth, Jennifer Ailey adaptation the BBC did in 1995, there has just been an onslaught. But the 16th of December this week is the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth. And so we're going to see a lot of commemoration. Some of this is now venturing into quite bizarre places. There's that classic sort of Whiggish history contempt for Austen, yes, her world and her thought world. And they've made none of the efforts that these good adaptations made into understanding how they might have thought and worked at that time. So this year we've got a racy new audio drama called Becoming Meg Dashwood, which focuses on the youngest Dashwood sister and her quest for female friendship, sexuality and liberation. You know, if there's two things Jane Austen is famed for, it's sexuality and liberation, you know. And Andrew Davis is said to be working on no fewer than 3 Austen projects, which he promises will feature psychopaths, slavery, and the famously hale and hearty Emma Woodhouse dying in childbirth. You know, I think maybe there's a point they feel that so much has been done with Jane Austen already that the only way to add anything new is to become increasingly crazy and also placing modern sensibilities on top of Jane Austen.
Yes, Jane Austen probably in anyone thinking's top 3 or top 5 greatest novelists in the English language is, like all great artists, like Shakespeare, like Wagner, someone whose work is so resonant and speaks to so many aspects of us that lesser talents always want to give us their interpretation of it. And you know, it is like Andrew Davis is a great writer, by the way, but it is rather like a child.
He's responsible for the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, which, you know, is amazing.
But so often it's like a child dipping their hands in paint and then slapping them onto a Van Gogh or onto a Renoir. You know, it's as though they have to be noticed by association. And the truth is, no, she's a genius.
Yeah.
You don't need to rewrite the dialogue. She is the mistress of understated wit, irony, genial malice, the revealing aside. It's all there. You don't need to add anything. And the plots don't need any emendation. So basically, the plot of Pride and Prejudice became the plot for Bridget Jones.
Yes.
The plot of Emma became the plot for Clueless.
Absolutely.
With Alicia Silverstone. And they are timeless. Actually, Bridget Jones and Clueless, if they are roots into Jane Austen, fantastic. But what is, I think you're right, you know, disappointing is the way in which people go back to the original texts and then try to shoehorn in their own obsessions.
Yes.
So Mansfield Park, which is probably one of the least fashionable or least liked of Jane Austen novels.
Yes, I think you're right. It's probably I would say objectively the least fashionable and probably perhaps the least liked.
Because one of the attractions of Jane Austen overall is that all her heroines, apart from the heroine of Mansfield Park, Fanny Price, all her heroines basically have a degree of spark about them and character. That doesn't mean that they are hashtag girl bosses, but it does mean that they've got something, feisty, for want of a better word. Fanny Price is passive. That doesn't mean that she is without agency. She, by expressing quiet disapproval, by declining to get drawn into what she considers to be the wrong or the immoral, she demonstrates a virtue which eventually prevails.
Yes.
But Mansfield Park is a novel about the obligations of family, morality, transgression, and also it's a very penetrating novel about masks. And one of the characters, Henry Crawford, who is superficially incredibly charming,
Yes.
is, a villain because of the ease with which he can act and assume different personalities and so on. So it's quite a telling psychological portrait. But all people now talk about in connection with Mansfield Park is slavery.
Yes.
Because one of the characters, the owner of the eponymous estate, Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas Bertram, disappears off to the West Indies at one point and then comes back, and it's in his absence that things go wrong. Now, of course, this was at a time when the West Indies was the scene of horrific exploitation of slaves. But the novel is not about that. It's an incidental element.
Yes.
But it's a reflection of our preoccupations that we have to turn Mansfield Park into a sort of proto civil rights tract.
Precisely.
And that Fanny Price has to be a sort of Rosa Parks in embryo, rather than looking at it in its own terms.
Yes, I agree. And the thing is that Austen is very clearly an abolitionist. This is really significant. There's Mansfield Park, which you allude to. Fanny Price asks questions at dinner that are not answered by the rest of the family about the estate. That's significant because she is the moral figure in that novel. And also there's a perhaps a little more overt critique of slavery in Emma by the character of Mrs. Elton, who clearly comes from a dodgy mercantile Reed enslaving family. Her extended family have clearly made money through
Bristol.
Exactly, from
Home
Bristol.
of the slave trade.
Yes, that is, but it's all, maybe it's because at the time these kind of inferences would have been clear to Austen's readership. She doesn't need to be more explicit than that.
No.
But the critique is there. It very much helps to explain Mrs. Elton's vulgarity as a character. And there is even an interesting likening between the slave trade and the governess trade through the character of Jane Fairfax. And this creates some awkwardness for Mrs. Elton. So I think it's very clear that Austen was an abolitionist, but she doesn't put her hand on the scales in the way that modern audiences would like. She's not, it's not 12 years a slave, but they have to, as you say, try to eradicate the author that we have and replace it with the one that they wish they had. And that's partly why I think that these adaptations don't really bring much illumination about Austen herself, because to really understand Austen, you need to get into the thought world of the late 18th, early 19th century to look at what the daughter of an Anglican vicar would have thought. Abolitionism, for example, is a burgeoning movement at this time, and it's definitely worthy of discussion, but it's not going to necessarily manifest itself in the way that people would like. But I think it's just too much effort for modern adapters to go back and try to understand Jane Austen's hinterland, the books she read, the thinkers that she appealed to her.
Completely. And of course, the politics of her time impinges, written in against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars, characters who are in the army and navy. And again, there's as you've pointed out, a political sensibility that suffuses the work. But life is not all about politics. It's ultimately about the nature of human relations and the complexity of character. And the thing about politics is, or political readings of works, is that they're often intended to look at works of literature as though they are manifestos for this point or that point.
Yes.
One of the bracing joys of reading Austen is that there are characters whom you find attractive, but who are also flawed. So one of the characters I love, see myself in, is Mr. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice.
I hope you're a better father than
Well,
he.
this is the thing. he has a wonderful laconic wit. But at the same time, he's a useless dad who doesn't, he's excessively fond, obviously, of his bright daughter Lizzie and his smart daughter, but he is delinquent, if you can use that phrase, as a dad.
Totally.
But the complexity of it is, at the same time, you can sort of understand he's someone who, in marrying Mrs. Bennet, married someone who was obviously delightful and charming and witty and pretty, but he's grown a little careworn over time.
He had the horn for her at the time, and then he comes to regret it.
Yes.
But Austen actually, I like the way that she's very restrained in these sorts of messages, because the generation of authors that preceded Austen was more moralistic. It's ironic that actually people often accuse Austen of being this great moralist, but there is a moralism to her books, but she was also very good at showing how characters often behave badly and they do not get their just desserts. Mr. Bennet fails to put any money aside for his 5 daughters. He's completely delinquent. He has not big, but he has a perfectly reasonable estate, certainly enough to put money aside. But him and Mrs. Bennet are so confident that they will ultimately have a son, because there's a complicated arrangement where it can only be left to a male relative, so it gets entailed away from the daughters, and they end up with minimal dowries. So it's just as well that 2 of the daughters marry very well.
Yes.
But he's not punished for that negligence, nor is Lydia Bennet is hardly punished at all for eloping and having premarital sex, which the generation of authors before her would probably have had Lydia die, a la Samuel Richardson. And even though it's not Clarissa's fault because she's raped, but she still dies. This is a big break from the precedent. And in Emma, for example, Frank Churchill behaves extremely badly. He lies to everyone in the neighbourhood and tricks and is unbelievably creative. He's an expert liar. He's brilliant at putting on a different face to different people. And at the end, the community of Highbury, Hartfield and Donwell Abbey is only too happy to forgive Frank Churchill, and he lives happily ever after. And even his aunt dies at a fortuitous time, so he's a rich man by the end of the novel. Like Jane Austen's not in the business of kind of moralising in this way.
It's not black and white and binary. And Frank Churchill does exhibit charm. But I mean, the thing about Emma is, tell me if I'm wrong here. I think that Emma is the least sympathetic heroine because I think that she is a bossy, interfering Sloane. The last element of which shouldn't add to the. But
where would the Conservative Party be without them?
Yeah, you're probably right. So the thing with Emma is that she ends up with Miss Knightley, who is a saint, who is.
I'm not sure.
Really?
Sure. Well, Mr. Knightley is, as his name suggests, gallant, courtly, and morally upstanding. But he can be a bit of a
pill.
Yeah, he could be he could be a bit dull sometimes. He's not. And this is partly his jealousy of Frank Churchill, who he thinks is making overtures at Emma that he doesn't yet realise he's in love with. And he can be a little. Because he's so much older than Emma, I think modern readers sometimes find some of the stuff of him kind of disciplining her almost in a fatherly way and then marrying her at the end a bit strange to modern eyes. But he also admits that he was wrong at times. Like although it's not as dark as Pride and Prejudice, where the 2 main characters both have to learn considerable lessons before they're able to kind of progress, and that's why they perhaps feel more like a marriage of equals, maybe. But Emma is, I think, partly this is to do with modern adaptations. They tend not to include signs of Emma's goodness. For example, Emma is a very diligent local sort of dignitary. She visits the poor regularly. She doesn't make a big thing of it, but there's quite a... She helps the people in a material way.
Yes.
The Bateses, she sends a big hindquarter of pork that will make a real difference to their. However, she's snobby about people who are just below her on the social, so she can't deal with George Martin, the nice local farmer, and the family, the Coles, because both of these groups represent social mobility that she's uncomfortable with because she sees herself as the Queen of Highbury.
Yes. She is good-hearted, but as you say, she's embedded in a very hierarchical view of things, which, again, in a way, the implied critique of that from Jane Austen is ahead of her time, in a way. Because, if one thinks of later novelists from the 19th century like Dickens or Trollope. One of the points that comes through consistently there is the existence of rigid class boundaries and how in marriage and elsewhere it's very difficult to cross them. So in depicting Emma as virtuous but hidebound and also inclined to be patronising and bossy, there is a sensitivity in the portrait that Jane Austen draws. And it's precisely, and this goes back to your original point, it's all there in the writing. You don't need to have an elucidation or certainly not a rewriting of it. If you have gold in front of you, then anything that you add to it will only end up with an inferior alloy.
Michael, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch this yet, but last week saw the release on Netflix of the latest instalment in the Knives Out series by Rian Johnson. And these are very popular whodunits, which I've seen the first two, not the third one yet. Really enjoyed the first one. I thought the second one was an absolute festering pile of cinematic dog turd. But, you know, each to their own. And it's interesting that we're still finding new ways to do the whodunit. It's a genre that shows no sign of going away, and it's constantly being reinvented. I mean, what do you think goes into the making of a great whodunit?
Well, I think that the golden age of crime, so-called, the sort of 20s and 30s, the age of Agatha Christie, I suppose it extends to the 40s as well and 50s, of Marjorie Allingham, of Dorothy Sayers, that seems to me to be the epitome of it. And so ideally what you want to have is a puzzle, whether it's a locked room mystery or otherwise, which is susceptible to being broken by the reader or viewer on the basis of the evidence presented during the course of the plot. And ideally, you want to have a range of potential suspects. So it's not obvious at the beginning who the killer might be, but the eventual unmasking should not be incredible. So your attention throughout is held by the fact that as evidence accumulates, you discover more about the character and the motivations of the potential killers. But while the detective may be smarter than you, it's not the case that the detective is operating in a realm that you could never access. So when Hercule Poirot or Lord Peter Wimsey or whoever it might be unmasks the villain, then you should follow it.
Yeah, interesting that in Sherlock Holmes and something like Poirot, there's often a kind of everyman sidekick to the main genius who perhaps more reflects the kind of assumptions that we, the muggles reading the book, might make. So you have your Dr. Watson, your Captain Hastings. I was about to say Captain Hitchens. That would be funny. Imagine Peter Hitchens
Captain Haddock.
Yeah, I'd love that. Oh my God, yeah, that would be amazing. I think you're right. It's very important that I often get annoyed, and I think it's some of Agatha Christie's best never do this, but some of the less good ones rely on information that is not really given to you. I don't like mistaken identity ones where someone that you're led to believe was so-and-so is actually so-and-so in disguise.
Yes.
If you're going to do that, you have to make sure there are actual clues to the disguise. For example, I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't read or seen it, but there's one called Mrs. McGinty's Dead, which I think is a Poirot. Yeah, it's a Poirot. And there's some mistaken identity there, but there are clues to that. So it's not, I feel that's fair game, but it's not fair game if they have suddenly introduced that there's identical twins or something like that. That's a literary device that you'd have to have superhuman powers of reasoning to detect. I think I love Dorothy L. Sayers. I think that there are certain rules that ought to be followed. So, for example, I've enjoyed all of the Peter Wimsey that I have ever read. My least favourite is probably Gaudy Night, which is set at Oxford College. There's actually not a murder in Gaudy Night, and I think that's a bit unfair. If you're going to set up a whodunit vibe, there ought to at least be one dead body. Otherwise, people will be, expecting a murder to come that never does. So I think that basic premise. My all-time favourites are ones where we're working retrospectively. Agatha Christie does this a bit, where you're solving a murder that happened some time ago and perhaps the wrong person has been convicted. So my favourite Poirot is Five Little Pigs. And there's also a Miss Marple called Sleeping Murder, which is another of my favourites. And both of these involve revisiting clues sometime after the events. People's recollections are hazy. But it's still possible to put the information together in a new way. And often, in order to reach the conclusion, the detective will find some new information that the authorities at the time were not privy to.
I, again, agree with you that for a whodunit to be perfect, then it must be possible for you, even if you haven't anticipated who the killer is, to have been able, as you look back, to think, aha, if only I'd been alerted. And that's what I think, Agatha Christie, as you say, does at her best and does most often. And that is the characteristic of the golden age of crime. It's also the case, however, that there are some crime writers from that period who write in such a way as to evoke an atmosphere, and it's the atmosphere rather than the characters necessarily that is so absorbing. So there's a murder mystery by Marjorie Allingham called The Tiger in the Smoke, which I love, which has an evocation of a decaying London, as it were, or a morally compromised London, which is genuinely absorbing in terms of atmosphere. One of the things, though, that struck me recently is that on telly, the idea of the intricate intellectual whodunit has come back. So I don't know if you've seen a series called Ludwig, which stars David Mitchell. I shan't say too much about it, but he plays someone whose day job is as a problem setter and problem solver, the sort of person who will compile crosswords for the Spectator, and who then finds himself at the heart of, as it happens, the Norfolk police force, Alan Partridge country, unravelling a series of crimes. Part of the joy of it is that David Mitchell's character has all the quirks that you'd want from a detective. In his case, he's not an alcoholic with a series of failed marriages behind him who's desperately wrestling his demons even as he fights evil. He's just a quiet crossword setter in a Fair Isle jumper who uses the power of mathematical logic to resolve these problems. Each episode is satisfying and wrapped up in a broader mystery. And it's also reassuringly old-fashioned, even though some of the issues with which it deals, Polish builders being blackmailed about whether or not they can be sent back home and so on. I'm sure that listeners can infer from this that my tastes in this respect are quite trad, but I think that again, you can have compelling whodunits on the basis of tortured detectives, on the basis of powerfully evoked atmospheres. But ultimately, it's the satisfactory resolution of a puzzle in which the evil are punished and law and order triumph. Don't want to be sort of too Shabana Mahmood-esque about it. That is the attraction.
Well, one thing I would say to that is that this is why people are so angry when you get to the end of a whodunit and they have not given you the requisite information.
Right.
Justice hasn't been done because it was not possible for the reader to come to the same conclusion. You feel very much cheated out of it. It's more often the case with a badly crafted TV drama than, let's say, something from the golden age of crime. But I have to say there is also a certain satisfaction in the total preposterous of many modern TV adaptations. I absolutely love Midsomer Murders. It's one of my all-time favourite shows. Sometimes they're beautifully, extremely well crafted and they leave clues in a clever way and they have a few red herrings that's beautifully crafted. Other times it is just insane, but often the murders themselves are totally jumping the shark. There's the one where Martine McCutcheon gets crushed by a giant wheel of cheese, for example. And I also love Taggart, just because the body count is always so high. Like it's sort of reflecting the dour Presbyterianism of Taggart. The body count is correspondingly higher than some adaptation set in leafy England, although obviously Midsomer Murders has pretty high body counts too. But my favourite ever Taggart episode is one where they keep finding these bodies which have been laid out in a very obvious way to look like famous works of classical art. And they become more and more obvious. Like the first one I think is, there's a dude who's like the death of Marat. And, anyone with like a rudimentary knowledge of art just goes, oh, it's the death of Marat. But the police do not see this at all. So they're pursuing they think it's to do with drugs. So they're pursuing all these drug dealers. And we're meant to believe that like the local thug has very carefully laid out the bodies to look exactly like a famous painting. Meanwhile, there's an art teacher that's very clearly the murderer. And then at the end, after about 10 bodies, they go, this is not about drugs, this is about art. And that always cracks me up.
Yes, and you can bring in, so, you know, there are brilliant writers brilliant contemporary writers, like Anthony Horowitz, who've brought in to murder mysteries all sorts of cultural references, pop culture, mid-cult, more recondite. And that is great fun. You've also got people who can bring in immensely powerful historical context. So Philip Kerr, now sadly deceased, his Bernie Gunther series about a copper from Weimar, Germany, who managed to survive through and beyond the Nazi years as a, you know, he's a sort of Philip Marlowe of the Second World War. They're both war novels and morality tales and brilliant whodunits. They're great. My unfulfilled desire, though, is, you mentioned Taggart. There are two polar opposite Scots murders that I'd love to see, or Scots murder novels that I'd love to see televised. One is Five Red Herrings, which is a Dorothy Sayers one, which is set amongst a community of artists and others in Galloway. It all revolves around railway timetables. It's so exquisitely...
Yeah, railways are very important in the classic murder mystery genre.
Exquisitely period piece.
Yes.
And I'd love to see Benedict Cumberbatch in that. But also, there is a writer, quite popular actually, called Stuart McBride, who set his murders in my hometown, Aberdeen. He has a character detective called Logan McRae. Taggart is in Glasgow. You expect murder in Glasgow. Rebus is in Edinburgh. Edinburgh is the town of Jekyll and Hyde, of hypocrisy, Burke and Hare, of hypocrisy and hidden villainy. Aberdeen is douce, provincial, unremarkable to outsiders, but behind the cold granite facade, evil lurks. So if there's anyone out there who is looking for a new set of murder mysteries, can I wholeheartedly recommend Stuart McBride and the Logan McRae series? And no, I'm not on commission.